Hi, good afternoon. We'll get started in just one moment as soon as all the attendees join. So hang on for just another minute or two. Thanks. All right, we'll get started in just one more quick minute. We'll go ahead and let all the attendees join and we will get started. All right, we've got a few other attendees coming in pretty slowly, but I think we've reached peak attendance. Thanks for joining the session this afternoon. My name is Brian Reed. I'm part of the cybersecurity strategy team here at Proofpoint and going to talk about deploying DLP for all of the wrong reasons. I've been at Proofpoint for a little over 6 months now, and previous to that, I was at Gartner for the last half decade or so and worked on DLP and data security and cloud security topics, and really wanted to put together a bit of a combination presentation of sort of lessons learned, things done right, things done wrong, and really just use it as a platform to really kind of give you some guidance around data loss prevention as a program and as a project. If you look in the chat window, we do have our Proofpoint virtual booth up and running. So if you would like to go by and actually look at some of our solutions around data loss prevention, around enterprise DLP, around insider threat management, please feel free to stop by there. And we are also doing a drawing for a wireless Bose headset as well. So wanted to plug both of those. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A session as we go through for the next 45 or 50 minutes. But I'm going to jump in and get started. So everyone has their own personal DLP horror story. And believe me, like I said, in my past life as an analyst, I've heard a lot of them over the years. And there's a lot of reasons why data loss prevention has really earned a bad reputation. We all know that data is attacked and at risk, and it's really been pretty poorly protected by the legacy tools that are out there. This is no surprise to anybody. These first two columns are from last year's Verizon 2020 DBIR. I believe the new DBIR is actually going to be published publicly tomorrow. I don't envision these stats changing a whole lot from year to year, but it's pretty clear that external breaches, the vast majority of those are using things like stolen credentials and cred phishing and the like. What's more interesting and relevant to the topic at hand, though, is legacy DLP tools really have a hard time with not just productivity and not just going through and triaging and troubleshooting, but legacy DLP has really had a hard time finding a home when it comes to working very closely with your security operations. And we don't ever hear about DLP really being an enabler for incident response. Sometimes during an incident, we might go and consult the DLP admin or the DLP logs, but a lot of times it's just sort of a backup to a backup. It's a tertiary kind of plan. And the problem is there's a serious amount of alert fatigue here, which is one of the reasons why it's not used. So like I said, DLP has a well-earned bad reputation. And I used to break down the DLP acronym like this, talking about data loss prevention. One of the problems why it has a well-earned bad rep is not all data types are covered. Traditionally, the vast majority of DLP solutions have been targeted at unstructured data, content within files, and a very limited set there. Doesn't cover all loss scenarios. So we're not accounting for every single possible permutation of how we could have loss. And then prevention is the other piece of this. You're not going to stop a motivated adversary with a DLP tool. There's a lot of I used to talk about this for years. There's a lot of low-tech and no-tech ways to defeat any DLP system out there. The reality is that DLP is not this panacea for stopping all types of data theft. It just doesn't work that way. One of the other problems we have is instead of viewing DLP as a technology problem, it's really a business problem at the end of the day. It starts with really understanding your people. And very few people that have gone and embarked on a data loss prevention program or started throwing tools and technology at the problem they haven't really stepped back and looked at the people element of this. If you look at data loss, it's ultimately rooted in people risk, and it's ultimately rooted in the decisions that people make with data. So if you don't understand your people and you don't understand why they're making the decisions that they're making with your data, you're not going to have a very successful data loss prevention program. You also need to follow a well-established, and that means a documented process. This can't just be an ad hoc program out there that's running with a set of rules that live in IT, that are created by IT, and don't have any sort of external review or consultation. And the biggest part of this, DLP, again, isn't a technology problem, it's a business problem, but it's got to be supported by really good technology controls once you understand that business problem. The three main use cases for DLP, largely over the course of the last decade and a half, have really remained unchanged. I used to talk about there's only three reasons why anybody in their right mind would deploy DLP. Usually the first one is you've got some sort of regulatory compliance requirement that you're looking to solve. Another reason is that you've got intellectual property as part of your organization that you're looking to protect, or at least get some visibility into the usage of that intellectual property. Is it being used in acceptable or known ways? Is it being shared appropriately, or are there other protections around the identity and encryption of that content? And then the third one is really an interesting case. A lot of people have used data loss prevention to provide an additional lens that maybe other technologies that you have in your ecosystem, in your stack, have not been able to help you with. So being able to just understand how sensitive data might be moving, help you understand through maybe a discovery process where you might have data residing that you think is there and are confirming it's there, or you might have data that's being put in inappropriate places. One of the problems with the data loss prevention product space and the legacy DLP market has been that the dirty secret here is there's really only a couple of different ways to crack content. Most of the providers out there are using a couple of OEM platforms to go in and crack that content. And it's very content centric. It's very data centric. In the old paradigm of looking at data in use at the endpoint, data at motion over the network, and data at rest on file shares and discovering data, it is largely an outdated model for DLP, especially in the world that we live in, where we're in this work from anywhere and data is everywhere approach. We can't just simply look to try to backhaul all of our traffic through our own network before it goes out to the internet again. That might create some network inefficiencies, let alone trying to do things like crack SSL. So there's a lot of problems with this legacy approach of data in use, data in motion, data at rest. Certainly from the data at use side, one of the problems that most users have come across at the endpoint is these heavy agents that are, quite frankly, a support and a stability nightmare. If you have a Windows 10 patch, if you have a Mac OS update, what's the potential look like if you have a kernel mode agent for causing incompatibilities? What if there's a browser update that you do to Google Chrome or Edge? Does that create some sort of incompatibility with your DLP control? One of the other problems here is that endpoint DLP is largely defenseless to that motivated adversary, like I mentioned earlier, things like hacking tools and steganography, the art of hiding text within images or embedding content within other files, is largely something that's blind to many legacy endpoint DLP solutions. Data in motion, it's obvious that network DLP, as it's been called, is really a struggle these days. When we have the vast majority of people that are still working remotely, in a post-pandemic world, we're going to be living with people that are perpetually hybrid. And we may have a number of our workforce that's digital nomads. They may never go in an office again. So trying to backhaul all of that traffic or trying to go through and decrypt all that traffic on the wire can create a lot of undue latency and burden on users. And then finally, data at rest or discovery. This is really the notion of going through and discovering all of your data. And the idea here is that you need to know where everything is, and you need to classify everything before you can be successful with DLP. And the answer to this is really a nuanced one. It's yes and no. It's certainly helpful, but it's not a hard and fast requirement to be successful to go do that discovery. One of the other problems I've seen with going about DLP all the wrong way is a lot of people go into this data loss prevention journey and think that it's a comprehensive data governance program. It very much is not. So data loss prevention, again, I've got sort of two columns set up here where you can see that DLP is predominantly maintained and driven by the information security group, and that typically in the organization structure falls under the CISO and or the CIO's purview. Where if you look at data governance, that's largely an operation. We're starting to see the emergence, and Gartner and Forrester and others have talked about the emergence of a chief data officer. And this really gets into some other areas of data management, specifically things like master data management, that fall out of the view of security altogether. So again, we've got to be really careful that we're not conflating data loss prevention with this be-all, end-all comprehensive data governance program, because it's really not. DLP has largely been sequestered to being a security function or an audit and compliance function. And it really hasn't reached up to the broader sense of all organizational data, which is where something like a data governance or a data security governance program would be. I mentioned a moment ago around data classification and DLP, and a lot of times data classification and DLP may or may not be joint efforts. And there's usually two different approaches to data classification. There's the user-driven classification approach, where users can manually go through and tag content, make changes to content and the like. And then there's also automated data classification, where you've got some sort of system going through and discovering that content, looking for content matches, applying appropriate tags. The real balance here is that you want some mix of both if you're going about a true data classification program. And you also want a DLP technology in place that can look at those tag values, that can help you make decisions and automate based on those tag values. Another phenomenon that happened 7 to 8 years ago in the DLP market is we tried to take something called user behavior analytics, UBA, or user and entity behavior analytics, as Gartner called it, to tune DLP. So the idea here is that DLP was very content-centric. It was very data-centric, looked at the values inside of data, and that was all great, but it didn't take into account the context. Where was that being used? Geolocation, time, scope of usage, looking for anomalies related to behavior patterns of data interactions. And one of the problems that we discovered with something like UEBA really working for your organization is it really turned into this. You needed a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And in many cases, it turned out you had too many cooks in the kitchen between people trying to tune UEBA solutions. And we saw some value out of UEBA, certainly helping to tune out things like false positives in SIMs and SOC operations. And to some degree, DLP tools have been pretty successful in certain circumstances with tuning out some of those false positives and redundant alerts and things like that in there, but not without needing a lot of that upfront effort, not without the significant time and resources to do that heavy baselining to really understand what correlated events and evidence look like. So as I mentioned, we live in this work from anywhere and data is everywhere world. And with that, we really need to think about a new security architecture. So the world that we lived in around DLP and looking to deploy data in use at the endpoint, data in network at the network proxies, and data at rest and file shares and databases and things like that really isn't effective. And it's really not the way that organizations work and operate and share data and need to secure data today. What we really need to do instead is take a broader understanding of some of the people and some of the risks that we face. So we face a number of different user risks out there. And we may have users out there that are just negligent or careless or accidental in the way that they work. One other thing that we've been talking about a lot at Proofpoint over the years has been this notion of very attacked people, or VAPs. And the idea around this is we may have people that have been compromised or may have lost their credentials in a credential phishing attack, or their account might have been taken over outright. DLP systems in the legacy sense don't have any concept when you have a content match, whether that user is really who they say they are. There's no sync back with the identity besides the currently logged in user or who that user looks like in the logs. There's no correlation back to saying this is indeed really what happened, or an hour before Brian accessed this file or tried to upload it to his personal Dropbox, his account was taken over. So it doesn't give you any of that insight. The other two common scenarios around user risk that we see a lot is both people coming into your organization and people leaving your organization. Those employees that are on watch lists or personal improvement plans, or who have given their notice, certainly get a lot of the press. But the other interesting thing here is the onboarding of employees. How much are we looking with our DLP programs into things like data infiltration? Are people bringing in assets or protected intellectual property from their previous employers and creating risk in our environment? That's something that we really need to take note of if we want to deploy DLP for some of the right reasons. There's obviously a lot of application and data risk out in the world as well. We've talked about the three main reasons for deploying DLP historically have been regulatory compliance, intellectual property protection, and data visibility and movement. We also want to understand and protect key sensitive business data. We want to look for fraudulent activity. We also might want to look for application use or misuse and have an understanding of, think about the early days of CASB and things like shadow IT coming into play. And we also want to look for cases of privileged abuse and potential corporate sabotage. So I mentioned that DLP cannot succeed alone with just content awareness. In my past analyst life, I used to talk about if you were focused on only content awareness, you were at best solving for half the problem. And actually at Gartner, one of the things that Gartner did in 2015 was they dropped the name content aware from the content aware data loss prevention market, and they renamed it to enterprise DLP. And the reason for that is that DLP really needed to have that understanding of context, as I mentioned earlier with UEBA, but it needed to go beyond that. We really needed to unpack things like user activity and user intent and the access content that context that somebody's taking. And we also needed to triangulate that with threat awareness. We needed to understand, is this account that's showing up in the logs, is this user really who they say they are, or were they compromised in some way? Are they phished? Has their account been taken over? And we need to tie that together with meaningful threat intelligence and some level of telemetry where we can sync that up with the things that we know about cloud account compromise and email account compromise, and look to see if that user's account has indeed been subject to something nefarious. So a little bit of old world, new world, data-centric DLP in the old world versus people-centric DLP today. I talked about the core data at rest, data in use and data in motion really being the old school way of thinking. And we really need to look at the channels that are operationally useful in the 2020s and beyond, which is really people performing a lot of their computing actions at the endpoint, sharing and collaborating over a number of platforms like your email systems, Office 365, G Suite, and the like, but also using very specific applications for tasks, Teams and Slack for real-time collaboration, platforms like Zoom for communications and broadcasting, platforms for file sharing like Box and Dropbox, and then business-specific applications, ServiceNow, Workday, and the like, and a number of custom applications. So really having the ability to look inside of that CASB layer and look for the data security elements that are relevant there. And again, some of the architecture and the time to value here is that we need a system that's not as heavy on-prem. I don't know a lot of CIOs out there that are busy showing off their new data centers, or people looking to buy gear that they want to go rack and stack in that data center. So it's really important to have solutions that can do all of those different things. Yeah, and a question came in around licensing. So if you're an existing Proofpoint customer, let's say you have PPS, TAP, and TRAP, there are a number of licensing options that we have to be able to add on DLP. Didn't want to turn this into too much of a product pitch, but in each of these channels, whether we're talking about email DLP, CASB DLP, or endpoint, we have a number of different on-ramps. So one of the other problems with this old world DLP approach is a lot of times vendors out there were trying to push you to deploy everything at once, which in reality created a lot of shelfware because there's a lot of tuning that needs to take place with these sorts of systems. So the ability to be selective about the right sizing that license is hugely important. I would definitely, if you're an existing Proofpoint customer, have some questions about licensing, the folks at our virtual booth can definitely help you and provide you some specifics on what exactly would be involved in your specific case. The next two slides, I really wanted to jump into some guidelines for building a successful DLP program and what some thoughts that you should really take away. And this comes from the last half decade of talking to a couple thousand end users. So some guidelines for building out a DLP program, a couple of big things here. Involve stakeholders early, ask them what their most sensitive data is. This is always an interesting thought exercise when you, if you're a CIO or a CISO or a director of security architecture or security manager, you might think you know what your organization's most sensitive data is, but I guarantee if you go ask a business unit leader, they're going to give you probably a different answer than what you might think. And if they give you the answer where they don't know, you could offer to run a program on getting some data visibility. You could say, hey, look, you might not have any idea the kinds of intellectual property we have out there. We can do some things there to help you out. And another parallel that we saw a lot to this was the cloud access security broker market. Early on, one of the things that people looked for was the use of unsanctioned applications. So kind of think the same way with the DLP program. Executive sponsorship, this doesn't just mean the CIO or CISO. Look outside, look to somebody outside the business. Your CFO, your COO, your head of HR and legal and privacy are all great sponsors for this. And there was a question that also came in around some tricks to define data governance structure, specifically in public sector orgs. Executive sponsorship really plays into this here as well. Because you're liable to have a number of different constituents that are at play here. So this is probably the biggest trick to defining the governance structure in something like a public sector org, a provincial government, a local government, those sorts of scenarios, is you need to have an understanding of who the data constituents are, what the most sensitive data is, and then work from there. It's one of those things, people try to get in this boil the ocean mentality with DLP, and it's really not successful. Another thing, if you're not familiar with the term RACI, so RACI charts are something that are pretty well known in the management world. And this has been something that's been really successful that I've seen over the years for DLP programs, is define who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted or informed. So if you go out and ask your stakeholders, what are the 5 most sensitive types of data that you care about? Or what are the 3 most critical assets you have? Make them accountable to tell you what those are. Make those constituents accountable to provide you updates if that scope changes. And then finally, adopting a proactive threat hunting mindset. This is really valuable here. So instead of just reactively waiting for this deluge of DLP events to come in, what can we do to be proactive? Well, some ways that we can be proactive are go look for specific or concerning usage. And a great way to do this, especially if you've recently changed roles, if you're in a newer organization, this works out really well. Go talk to HR, go talk to legal, and ask for some past historical issues. Heaven forbid your organization's been part of a data breach or a data privacy event. But those are things that you can take some of those past lessons and potentially use those and flip those around and make a bit more of a proactive approach to things. So there's a lot of wrong reasons to deploy DLP at the end of the day. One of the biggest ones that I see is using DLP to investigate only fringe or outlier cases. I used to talk about this for years, about this notion of playing this game about whataboutisms. And it really gets into, if you're doing DLP the right way, this should really feed into your security awareness training, especially when we talk about negligence or carelessness or accidental use cases. This is really a situation where in those cases, it's not going to help you much for a malicious insider. It's not going to help you for somebody who's truly trying to do bad, but people who are just acting in an ignorant or unknowledgeable manner. This is really a great way to be able to tie this into your security awareness program. One of the things we do here at Proofpoint, and I just answered another question online around this, is we have a number of security awareness training modules in our Proofpoint security awareness training that are very geared toward DLP violations. So things like sensitive data handling, privacy requirements, compliance requirements. Those are all things that you could use as a remediation. So focusing on those fringe or outlier cases, especially the ones that don't have any real business relevance or risk, is a big problem. I mentioned this earlier, thinking that DLP equals a data security governance program, and it really doesn't. DLP does not equal a complete data security governance because DLP lacks that complete content coverage. It lacks the context around the data linkage, and you're not getting the threat perspective here either. You're not understanding what's going on from the people-centric point of view of, is that user really who they say they are or not? Another one I saw a lot, particularly with our friends in the EU and in other privacy-centric places in the world, like Brazil, with the rise of their LGPD, which is Brazil's version of GDPR, and other places, thinking you can't do DLP because of privacy. This is another one where a lot of times I've seen security teams try to use this as a bit of a cop-out, that we can't do DLP because of privacy. And this is exactly why working with things like HR, legal, privacy, works councils, and others are so important. It's not just a blanket no answer to doing DLP if you're in a privacy-centric world. It's a much more nuanced answer than that. So you can explore a number of processes and controls to at least ensure things like data subject privacy. So anonymization, redaction of logging, obfuscation, role-based access control, least privilege administration are all ways that you can do that. Another big point here, and I saw this a lot over the years, is determining if you really want to deploy DLP at all. Back in my business school days, one of the earliest lessons I learned was that making no decision is a decision. So it's very much the case that you want to really decide, do you want to do DLP at all? Or do you want to look at doing something much more like a targeted program, like an insider threat or insider risk program, or maybe you're only focused on onboarding employees, looking at people over the first 30, 60, 90 days, or tracking your departing employees or tracking your suppliers. Maybe a program like that is more appropriate than an everyday DLP program for everybody in the organization that's a bit cookie cutter and vanilla. The other big problem I saw over the years was looking for a single product, easy button for DLP technical controls. And trust me, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing. And your DLP programs really, it shouldn't be wrapped around a product anyway. But it definitely shouldn't be wrapped around a single product approach. What you really want to think about is an ecosystem. And what you want to look for from vendors and products is something that can work with other systems, especially to bridge things like identity and access management, privileged access management, user behaviors and threats with that good content awareness capability. So you really want something that plays nice with others, that can fit into your tools and your security ecosystem. So successful DLP programs require really understanding that people risk. So I mentioned Proofpoint looking at this notion of VAP, very attacked persons. But we can turn that abbreviation on its ear a little bit and talk about VAPs standing for vulnerability, attack, and privilege. And with vulnerability, we really want to understand who in our user install base, who in our user population is most likely to succumb to or fall for threats related to data loss. From the attack perspective, we might have certain groups of users, we might have certain individuals who are going to get targeted more than others. And then we ultimately invariably have a spectrum of privilege in our organizations where if somebody's account were to get breached, it would be a lot more meaningful than somebody that has no amount of privileges. So one of the things that we have here at Proofpoint, and this is included for free with all of our bundles. So if you're a Proofpoint customer with bundles, what we've included is this Nexus People Risk Explorer dashboard. And what we can do is we can take in, so if you have our TAP, our Targeted Attack Protection, our Cloud Account Defense, our CASB product, and our Proofpoint Security Awareness Training, we can take in inputs along with your identity information, and we can help you answer who are my riskiest users and what makes them so risky. And we can also trend and benchmark that over time. This is an area where a lot of security and risk management leaders have really struggled over the years of trying to determine and try to report on people risk as opposed to reporting on data risks. Because it's been really hard up until now to triangulate and point to, oh, well, my president and CEO might not be the riskiest person out there. It might actually be my president and CEO's executive assistant, or it might be my COO, or it might be somebody else who's leading a critical project. So there's a number of ways that you can slice and dice people risk. Another key element to doing DLP the right way is really understanding your users through user risk profiling. So doing things like building out intelligent watch lists where you can prioritize different users and you can earmark certain groups or certain individuals with different tolerances based on their profiles. You might be a lot more forgiving of sharing PII or privacy data inside your HR department than you are with your contractors or suppliers. Another important piece to this whole puzzle is unified visibility, which doesn't just mean cracking into files and understanding the content in there. It really revolves around user activity, understanding the application, usage patterns, normal user behavior of interfacing with those applications. It's the data interactions, and then it's also having an understanding of the known threats that might be out there. So the idea of context-based user risk management plays into this. We need a way that we can take those user risk profiles. We can take maybe some of the data classification stuff that you've done if you've started using things like Microsoft Information Protection for sensitivity labels to unstructured data. We can take those and create rules and an understanding there, and we can build a timeline view of context to really get an understanding not just of a data event in question itself, but we can go through and look at what happens before that data event and after that data event. Why this is important is that if we break this all down, data doesn't just lose itself. A lot of us here at Proofpoint will say data doesn't just grow legs and walk out of your organization. There's a person behind it. And in my analyst life, I used to talk about data loss as there's either a person or a broken business process behind it. So somebody might have left automation gone amok or some sort of automated process or program that causes data loss, but it's ultimately rooted in people. And we all have a notion, or at least a pretty good idea probably, of where your data should be and where it shouldn't be inside of your organization. So mapping that up to the different types of high-level user personas out there, I've talked about negligent negligent or careless or accidental users out there. And there's certainly the case where those are out there. There's also compromised or phished users. And then there are the truly malicious users. While in the minority, we do need to be careful to understand them. So I'm going to go through a little bit of context and correlation about what this looks like and what aggregating data into a unified view gets for you. So this is a little bit of an interactive demo of what our system would look like and the kind of workflow that you're really looking at when you're looking at investigating a user and taking a people-centric view of data loss. So we're going to go through the activity of Georgie Adams, who's a sales rep that was flagged as a high-risk user by her manager or possibly by HR. And we're going to look through an activity timeline. So as we go through, we can see Georgie opens her browser, pretty standard, and navigates to salesforce.com, which is their SaaS application, goes ahead and logs in. and at the login screen, puts in her valid credentials to do so, and then downloads a spreadsheet of data. So downloading data from Salesforce ends up being flagged as a soft alert by her company, so showing up in yellow as something of caution to take note. She opens Windows Explorer on her desktop, goes to a specific directory, goes to the option to rename a file. And she then renames the spreadsheet to a different name. So instead of being a XLSX file that was a bunch of client profiles exported from Salesforce, renames it to holidaypictures.jpg. From here, she then moves the file to a cloud sync folder on her desktop, which triggers a data exfiltration alert. So obviously trying to actively exfiltrate that data is something that would get caught. So there's a lot of things that happen before this event in red, and it's important to understand step by step how that ended up happening. This can help you unpack whether this was truly a malicious activity, whether this was something that was negligent or careless. But really having that ability to go through and quickly review an activity timeline is the real value point here. And you want to be able to dig in and do some further analysis, and potentially through policy in our system, you could even go through and gather things like screenshots of those actual step-by-step cases. So we could use those either as a point of user training and security awareness, or we could use those as a point of evidence if this were truly a case of malicious data exfiltration. So as I mentioned, there's a spectrum of user risk out there, and it covers negligence, compromised, and malicious users. There's endless amounts of scenarios that you could pour into these, but having a system that you can fine tune around all these is important. The other thing at Proofpoint that we've done is we've put a lot of effort into this notion of unified alert management. One of the other historic problems with DLP has been you've got to jump around to multiple consoles and multiple systems, and correlating and confirming an event is something that's really tough to do. So one of the things that we've done with our unified alert management is, regardless of channel, whether we're looking at cloud events or email events or endpoint events, we can correlate all those events together and provide not just file activity details, not just the content-centric pieces of DLP, but really provide that historical context of user behavior and threat awareness. I mentioned earlier, one of the ways to do DLP the right way is to take a proactive approach to DLP. One of the features that we've added is this filtering and searching capability that we call data explorations. So you can have customized queries that are standing by waiting for those events to trigger, that proactively look at, hey, I've got a bunch of software developers that historically don't want DLP agents on their system. Let's put an insider threat management agent on their system and just look for all the GitHub locations that they go to from their endpoint. We could trigger that on that crown jewels file movement area that you see here. We could look for specific places where they might be uploading certain files or certain directories, or interfacing with certain GitHub locations. We could do the same thing with looking for PowerShell execution that is happening on non-administrative machines. So there's a lot of different ways that we could look for not just data loss events, but we could look for anomalous user activity that might not be normal. The other thing that we can do is we can accelerate investigations with some of these irrefutable evidence points. So gathering screenshots instead of having these complex draconian logs, or attaching PCAPs of network traffic. A lot easier to communicate with HR and legal and privacy in the business if you've got a screenshot there to show somebody. And finally, the biggest point of all here is integration with your existing security ecosystem. So all of you have some sort of security ecosystem in place by the vendors that you have in your environment, the solutions that you're utilizing, how you're performing security operations. You need to make sure you've got a solution that can tie in with all of that. So one of the things that we've done here at Proofpoint is we've really built out that unified alert management capability with an API-first architecture. So we've got integration through our notification API with different SIM solutions and SOAR solutions for automation, and different authentication solutions for tying in with identity and access management and privileged access management solutions. Wrapping up a little bit early, but wanted to really just bring home the point that protection really starts with people. Again, the people that end up deploying DLP for all the wrong reasons tend to shine way too much focus on the content-centric part of DLP. And again, keep in mind that you can't survive on content awareness alone when it comes to DLP. You've got to have an understanding of your people risk, your user behavior, and the threat awareness angle to this. So it's really about looking for a platform that's people-centric, looking for a way that is focused on people first, as opposed to focused on data only. And with that, I know I've answered a couple of questions along the way, but if anybody else has any other questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat or the Q&A session, and happy to answer those. And looks like I'll hang on a second and see if there's any more questions. I did want to remind everybody that you can stop by our virtual booth to do a demo or a POC of any of the solutions that I showed, our unified alert management capabilities. And again, there's also going to be a drawing for a wireless Bose headset here as well. And I think we've got a couple of questions coming in the Q&A. So the question that came in, when it comes to DLP, how frequently is the analog hole the actual problem? And if you're talking about the analog hole, meaning just looking at one alert or one event and going by that, it tends to be often because people aren't cross-correlating that with some of the other tools that are in place. That's why I really mentioned toward the end that the security ecosystem is important. So tying that into privilege, tying that into identity, tying that into the other solutions you have. And I got another question. Do these questions on Zoom even get to be seen? Yes, they do get to be seen. The analog hole, okay, so the analog hole meaning somebody taking a photo of a document with their mobile camera. So I mentioned there's a lot of low-tech and no-tech ways to defeat DLP. I don't know of a solution out there that can stop somebody from taking a picture of a screen with their camera phone and going on about their day. This is part of the problem that you get into with the whataboutisms that happen out there. If you let the whataboutisms take over your ability to get a program started with some tightly defined rules, then that's going to be a problem. Is Windows PSR application a good way to do screenshots? I guess so. I don't know. There's a lot of different screenshotting technologies out there. When I mentioned doing screenshots with some of the events that I showed in the case of our logs, we actually have our own proprietary technology in our agent that does that screenshotting. So I think I'm looking for any other answers. So does Proofpoint provide a holistic data classification DLP solution? So yes, we do have an entire enterprise DLP platform. We do not have a data classification solution per se. One of the approaches that we've taken is looking at Microsoft information protection sensitive labels. So looking at MIP classification. So if you do have MIP, or if you've gone down the road of utilizing MIP, we can take advantage of that. And I think that might be it. All right, gonna wait one more second for some questions to come in, but I think that might wrap it up. All right, with that being said, please stop by our virtual booth here at the event. Thank you so much for taking the time for this session, and have a great rest of the conference.